World War II was still raging in March 1944 and had bloodied the European and African terrains. The war in the Italian peninsula had made the country a sort of arena in which the Allied forces, particularly the Americans and the British, were slowly but steadily pushing their way north against German units, which were well dug in the mountains and strongly defending their positions. Cities and towns were bombed. Roads became unusable. At least 20 million civilians fled the fighting, abandoned their homes, and made their way towards safety. The refugees had few and risky options to travel. However, the freight trains were still running through the cities and towns of the war-ridden Italy, and were, thus, the only way left to transport goods and people. Of course, these trains were not designed for passengers, but hundreds of desperate people still found them the only way of transportation and managed to board them. In the night of March 3rd, a freight train was ready to take a difficult road to travel over the mountains of the southern Italy. The path was hard, even if the weather was clear and the road was in good condition. However, it was far from perfect tonight. Michele Paulo, a young man of 24 years, was in the caboose at the end of the train and was doing his final checking before the departure, by his own estimation. As the brake operator for the back half of the train, Michele's role was very important, especially in mountain routes. If the train lost traction or power on an uphill, it would start sliding backward. Michele, in that case, would have to immediately apply the brake to prevent a disastrous accident. Tonight, nothing was right. Michele knew that, and he could feel it. Firstly, the weather was bad. The freezing rain with snow, which had been going on for hours, had made the tracks very slippery. It was going to be difficult for the train wheels to have a good grip on the steep mountain grades. Secondly, the coal was of very poor quality. Normally, high-quality coal is used for trains, as it burns hot and clean and provides constant power. However, due to the war, all the good coal has been designated for the military. What is left is the stuff that is full of pollutants and that burns inefficiently, therefore producing less heat and power. It would be difficult for the engine to generate the needed power. Thirdly, the train was heavily overloaded. Michele had earlier made a count of the illegal passengers on the train and realized that there were more than 500 people who had secretly boarded that particular train. They had occupied every freight car, sat on the top of the cars, and even held onto the sides. All of them were fleeing the war and were hopeful to get to safer places of Italy. It was the duty of the train crew to report the presence of stowaways on the train and have them removed. However, how could they do that? These are people who had fled the war, women, children, the elderly. They had nothing except the clothes they were wearing. In total, it would have been inhumane to turn them away. So the crew chose to look away and allowed them to ride. But that kindness came at a price. All the extra weight meant that the engine had to work harder, thus more fuel had to be burned, and the engine had to struggle more on slopes. Michele made one more check of his equipment. Everything seemed to be in order, and his lantern was fully loaded with oil. He could see the whole train from where he was. Without a moment's delay at 1 o'clock in the morning, the train moved forward and commenced its journey. In the first few miles, the terrain was quite flat, and the train managed to go on steadily despite the bad weather. But after that, a mountain was there, and so was the real challenge. The slope became steeper. Michele was able to feel the train losing speed and the engine struggling. The train's wheels would sometimes spin on the wet rail before regaining their grip again. It was almost like seeing a worn-out climber trying to reach the peak of a mountain, and every step taken was a battle. However, the train did not stop moving. It moved slowly and with great difficulty, but nevertheless, it moved forward. Michele was allowed to feel a little bit of hope. Perhaps they would make it after all. He was able to spot the tunnel ahead of them, which was a passage that had been cut through the mountain and would give the train a cover from the bad weather. Moreover, the tracks would be dry inside the tunnel. Hence, the train's wheels would have more grip. They just had to get there. The engine of the train was the first to come into the tunnel. Michele, as the light in the caboose shining on the rest of the train, felt the train's speed getting a bit faster with more and more cars moving onto the dry tracks. They were going to make it. Michele felt relief. However, the train was slowing down right after that. What was the reason? They were already in the tunnel. The tracks were dry. So, what could be the reason? There was absolutely no movement for the train. Michele was in the caboose, which remained just outside the tunnel entrance, and the rest of the train was motionless inside the tunnel. This was unusual. Usually, when the train stops, the conductor at once local signals with his whistle, which different crew members can see and hear, even though they cannot communicate by voice or visually. Different whistle signals allowed different communication to be carried out. Apply brakes, release brakes, all clear, emergency. The crew members located this way coordinated the work when they were out of sight of each other. But no conductor, only silence was there, interrupted by the sound of the engine somewhere up ahead, which is waiting for its next job, and the gentle rain hitting the top of the caboose. Michele took hold of the brake lever and prepared to lock it in case of need. Perhaps the conductor was determining the situation before providing orders. He would wait. 1 minute had passed when 2 minutes came along in this same situation. There were still no whistles and no movement. Something was really not right here. Michele was able to know it by his sixth sense, at the same intuition which warned him that it was a dangerous journey all through the night. Not following the rules, Michele left his post. He exited the caboose and walked forward along the train, going into the tunnel. He had to know what was going on. He opened the door of the first car and found it full of sleeping refugees. Men, women, and children lying tightly together on the floor, each using what they had as a pillow pieces of clothes, bags, even their own arms. The train's slight movement had put many to sleep, even though the conditions were uncomfortable. Michele was very quiet, and thus no one was woken up by him as he was moving through the people. These were the people who would take any rest they were able to get. While going to the next car, he discovered a noise, the sound of regular heavy hitting the ground, and it was getting louder and louder in the tunnel. It seemed that something big was hitting the ground outside the train. However, what could it be? Is it the shifting of the cargo? The falling of the debris from the roof of the tunnel? Once he was in the second car, he decided to call the police immediately, as the situation was terribly serious. This car was very different from the other. It was so quiet that it was a scary silence instead of the comforting one. His whistle was heard. No one was breathing. No one was even stirring. There was nothing. Michele halted. His hand went to the flashlight on his belt, holding it together, trying not to use the flashlight so he could leave the refugees in their darkness. But now his gut was yelling at him to look, to see what was wrong. He turned on the flashlight and aimed the light across the nearest bodies. The flashlight showed a multitude of people lying still on the ground. However, these people were not sleeping. Their lips were blue. Their skin looked grayish. Their eyes were wide open, and their gaze was fixed on nothing. They were all dead. Michele shouted, and the flashlight fell from his hand. It hit the floor with a metallic sound, and the light was moving randomly until it stopped at the face of a young woman who would never see another sunrise. He fled. He fled back through the first car, not caring if he woke anyone, though now he was wondering if anyone in that car was still alive. He ran out of the tunnel into the rain and fell down the mountain, his lungs screaming, his heart pounding. He got to a railroad station and fell down, gasping for breath, trying to explain what he had seen. The station master called for help, and within hours, rescue teams were at the tunnel. That was the scene of the worst disaster in the Italian railroad history. The train stopped inside the tunnel because the engine, which was already weak due to bad coal, couldn't go against the weight and the slope. When the train stopped, the conductor and engineers, who did what they were trained to do. They started shoveling huge amounts of coal into the firebox to create enough power to get the train going again. However, that low-quality, impure coal generated a lot of carbon monoxide when it was burned, especially in such a large amount. Also, all that carbon monoxide had nowhere to go. It was filling the tunnel with a lethal, invisible, odorless gas. The people who bravely fought it and died in their sleep were those who lost their consciousness within the next few minutes. They passed away without realizing what was happening. The thumping sounds Michele had heard, those were the corpses falling off the tops of the train cars as people died and fell. Out of the 600 people on the train, including the crew and the refugees, about 521 were found dead. Michele Paulo, by the grace of the caboose remaining outside the tunnel, was the only one who survived. A few others, who were near doors or openings where fresh air was coming, were able to live as well. The disaster went down in history as the Balvano train catastrophe. It is still one of the most terrible railroad accidents ever, and one of the worst cases of carbon monoxide poisoning for which people have survived. After that night, the scare of the incident kept coming back to the survivors' minds, especially to Michele Paulo, who felt the weight of the guilt on his shoulders. Why was it him that survived when so many were dead? Why was it him that stayed in the caboose instead of being inside the tunnel with everyone else? But there was no answer. Sometimes survival is just a matter of luck. Sometimes the only difference between life and death is being at the right place at the right time. The refugees on that train had been seeking safety, seeking a better future. Instead, they found death in the darkness of a tunnel, never reaching the destination they'd risked everything to find.